Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Church of the Covenant. My name is Amy Starr Redwine, and I'm one of the pastors here at the church on behalf of our congregation and our staff. It's my pleasure to welcome you here for our annual Covenant Lecture. Before I tell you more about this afternoon's lecturer, I'd like to take a moment to thank those who made this event possible. First, for the generous and anonymous donor who established the Covenant Lecture Fund, which allows us to bring in a renowned speaker and invite the community to join us at no charge. Second, it's been a real privilege for me this year to partner with three organizations that do such great work in our community. The first is the Cleveland Clinic Department of Spiritual Care, led by the Reverend Amy Green. I called Amy about 6 months ago and suggested that we partner in presenting a lecture, and her enthusiasm, energy, and the ideas she came up with really are what got us here today. So without Amy and the Cleveland Clinic's support, Ellen wouldn't be here today, and so we thank them. I'm also grateful to the Hospice of the Western Reserve for their sponsorship, and particularly to Chief Marketing and Business Development Officer Michelle Seranian and President and CEO Bill Finn, who've both been working for years to elevate this particular conversation throughout our community. We also appreciate the sponsorship of University Hospital Cleveland Medical Center's Department of Palliative Care, led by Dr. Ken Rosenfeld. Ken is a recent transplant to Cleveland from California, and he brings with him a wealth of knowledge and experience in engaging communities to have meaningful conversations about end-of-life wishes. Please join me in thanking these generous sponsors. And now for this year's Covenant Lecture, we are very pleased to welcome Ellen Goodman from the Conversation Project, a public health organization that she founded after her retirement from an award-winning career in journalism. This career began when Ellen worked as a researcher for Newsweek magazine in the 1960s, when only men were allowed to be writers. She eventually became a reporter for the Detroit Free Press and then the Boston Globe, where she began writing a regular column in 1974. That column was syndicated 2 years later and appeared twice weekly across the country until 2010. Ellen was one of the first women to appear in the op-ed pages and the most widely syndicated progressive columnist in the country at the time. She won the Pulitzer Prize for her work in 1980, and she's got a long list of other honors. I'll share a few. The American Society of Newspaper Editors Distinguished Writing Award, the Hubert H. Humphrey Civil Rights Award from the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, the President's Award of the National Women's Political Caucus, the American Woman Award from the Women's Research and Education Institute, and the Ernie Pyle Award for Lifetime Achievement from the National Society of Newspaper Columnists. And all that was before she retired and founded the Conversation Project, which is what we will get to hear her talk about today. So I will just say, because Ellen will be telling us more about the Conversation Project, that if you're not familiar with her writing, it truly is worth revisiting. Even years later, it provides a relevant, honest assessment of social change and its impact on our culture, with remarkable insight and a very welcome sense of humor. So I want to simply share, as we bring Ellen up to tell us more about the Conversation Project, how honored we are to have her with us today. I can't think of a better person to help this community recognize the value of deepening our relationships with those we love by having conversations about our end-of-life wishes. Ellen is traveling today with the executive director of the Conversation Project, Harriet Warshaw. Ellen and Harriet, thank you so much for being here, and welcome.
Thank you. This is a beautiful, beautiful venue. I really appreciate being here, and I suppose I should confess that what I really am is a recovering journalist. After a lifetime of covering social change as a journalist, I'm now here talking to all of you about making social change. I remember many years ago overhearing my daughter in the other room, and a friend of hers had said, "What does your mother do?" And there was this kind of pause, and Katie said, "Oh, my mother's a columnist." And then there was this other pause when her friend said, "What's that?" which was a lengthy pause. And finally I heard Katie say, "Well, my mother gets paid for telling people what she thinks." So some years ago, when I was invited to teach a course at Stanford, I decided to call it Telling People What You Think. And I arrived on the campus at Stanford, and in the course catalog it said Ellen Goodman is here as a visiting professor, and she will be teaching a course called Telling People What to Think. So this was definitely not what I did. So I went down to the registrar's office, and she was very, very apologetic, and she sent out a campus-wide email correcting this and saying Ellen Goodman is here as a visiting professor, and she will be teaching a course called Telling People How They Think. So I went from being a fascist to being a neurologist. And that brief moment of neurology is, I assure you, the only medical qualification that I have for the work that I am doing now as founder of the Conversation Project. The Conversation Project is asking us to engage in the most important conversation Americans aren't having. We're asking for an audacious change to see that everyone's end-of-life care wishes are both expressed and respected, and that more of the people we love will die in the way that they will choose. So I'm hugely impressed at the work some of you have already been doing in this community to give us the space to talk about bereavement, loss, end of life. Nevertheless, I suspect that some of you have come on this chilly day with a certain measure of uncertainty about how and even whether you can talk to the people you love about dying, the D word. For so many of us, dying feels suspiciously and superstitiously, talking about dying feels suspiciously and superstitiously like letting death into the room. So I'm going to ask all of you for the next few minutes to take off your professional hats and to just think with me about, think of yourselves as daughters, as brothers, as mothers, as family members. I hope that you will leave here also committed to being agents of change and champions of a change in the way we live at the end of our lives that I think can help transform our country. First, let me remind you of how much change we all have been through already that we may not always recognize, because medicine has changed too. The dates and the ages of death on all of the memorials that we all see have truly changed. My mother's generation regarded doctors as doctor gods, delivering diagnoses from the mount and prescriptions like tablets. My generation is more likely to regard doctors as partners, and my daughter's generation more likely to regard them as junior partners in our health care. It's been over 40 years since that publication of the most important health care manual for my generation of women, Our Bodies, Ourselves. That, as many of you have read it, was a seminal book that created in my hometown that told women who knew astonishing little about their own bodies to take ownership of that information. In some ways, it was the beginning of what we often think of as people-centered medicine. Today, of course, people are getting information, misinformation, and disinformation from all sorts of places. Before they go see a healthcare provider, they have, for example, gone to see Dr. Google. Many of them have also had ads pitched to them on television with the inevitable disclaimer, "Ask your doctor." The evening news is punctuated by COPD and promises that if you take Cialis, you can have sex in 2 bathtubs. I haven't figured out how they do that yet. So people may come to their doctor with a diagnosis from a blog and a prognosis from a television show. They've chatted about their symptoms on Facebook and joined a Twitter group. There is a message in all of this that medicine has to become more person and family-centered. We are no longer in an era when healthcare providers can control. They have to rather engage. And let me just say that this evolving world puts a stronger priority on conversations with families and conversations too in the public space. The second and related change is about demography. Need I remind you that the baby boom generation have been the primary change agents of our culture. We led the civil rights movement. We led the women's rights movement, the gay rights movement. We are the pro-change generation. Now, willy-nilly, ready or not, we have embarked on another huge social change, the longevity revolution. In the last century, the average American lifestyle has increased by 30 years. That's huge. In 1900, the typical American lived to be age 47. Today, the typical American lives to be 78, and for women, over 80. There are almost 60 million Americans over 55 today, and in another quarter century, there will be over 100 million every day. Another 10,000 baby boomers turn 65 and tells us all about it. We know this in terms of the numbers, arithmetic, but Americans haven't quite absorbed that emotionally or personally. We are told, for example, that 50 is the new 40, but we are not told that 50 is the new caregiver of the 75-year-old and 65 is the new caregiver of the 85-year-old. That famous sandwich generation has become the club sandwich generation. So we have also a generation that we are told is poised to overwhelm the healthcare system. But we also have this same generation of people who were encouraged to lead examined lives and who are poised to do something rather new, poised to examine how we want to live, how we want to be listened to, as well as listen to the very end of our lives. Technology has led to all of these modern miracles which we appreciate and the ability to prolong life. It's also made it much more likely that death will not come in what we used to think of as a natural way. It's made it clear that many of us will face a cascading and confusing set of decisions as we and our loved ones come toward the end. The very healthcare improvements that have led us to the longevity revolution have also led us to a moment when we need to face the one difficult and critical conversation that we have avoided for far, far too long. The conversations about how we want to live toward the end of our lives. If there is a condition that everyone in this wide, diverse, contentious world shares, it's this. It's our mortality. There is no margin of error in this survey. In fact, one of my favorite lines about this comes from the online satirical magazine, The Onion, which says, "Death rate holds steady at 100%. So we are all mortal, and yet, as you all know, we have been immeasurably slow in recognizing and acknowledging how many of the people we love are not dying in the way that they would choose. If we are to tackle then a problem that will literally affect everyone, we have to think big. We need to change the way the people we love are dying. This is the belief that's at the heart of the work that we are doing at the Conversation Project, a public engagement campaign to help change the cultural norm from not talking about our wishes to talking about them, and making this part of the normal adult checklist of responsibilities. 4 years ago, the Conversation Project did a national survey, and that national survey said that 90% of Americans think it's important to have these conversations. 90% of Americans do not agree on anything, including the national anthem. But on the other hand, only 30%, less than 30%, are actually having these conversations. Most of them defended their reticence to involve themselves in these conversations by saying, oh, it's just too soon. But in fact, we know that it's always too soon until it's too late. So the good news is that the importance is finally breaking through. The bad news is that we are still faced with this reticence, this tongue-tied hesitancy in knowing how to begin these conversations. And we need to close that gap between the 90 and the 30. Most of the social changes that we have been through in my lifetime came about because people began to tell their stories. I found that when I talk about the Conversation Project, there is often a pause, and then out pours a story. Often a story that had been kept under wraps or someplace so deep in people's hearts that they didn't express them until suddenly they were given permission to do that. This is very parallel to my experience with the women's movement. When that began, everyone had a story of sex discrimination or harassment, and yet everyone felt alone. We're seeing that again in the Harvey Weinstein stories. And yet when those stories are finally shared, that is the beginning of social change. So I began my involvement with this issue because I had my own story. Around the time I turned 60, I went from being a working mother to being a working daughter. I'm sure many of you know exactly what I mean. My mother began a long, slow decline. As she went into her 90s and was no longer able to decide what she would want for lunch, let alone what she would want for health care, those decisions started to fall to me. And I assure you, I was blindsided. I was unprepared. I had no idea, and I felt completely unqualified to make those decisions. My mother and I could talk about everything. I once wrote about her and described her as a woman who would listen to me talk about my problems until I was bored with them. But the closest we ever came to talking about her end-of-life wishes is when she would see someone in bad condition, she would point and say, "If I'm ever like that, pull the plug." But of course, when the time came, there was no plug to pull. There rarely is. So when my mother died, I began to talk to others. We shared stories of our loved ones, the good deaths and the hard deaths. I found out that I was by no means alone, and a group of us, caregivers, clergy, media, began to meet. And we too took off our professional hats and shared our stories. And then we asked each other, how could we make this easier? How could our loved ones live at the end of their lives in ways they would want? How could their survivors and in time, our own survivors be left with less guilt, with less uncertainty about whether or not we had done the right thing. In surveys, 70% of people have said that they want to die at home, for example, and yet 70% of people have died in hospitals and institutions. Home is not just a literal physical place, but it's an idea of how you want to die, surrounded by people you love, in comfort, not in pain, not in an ICU. I've yet to meet anyone who says, I want to die in an ICU. We began to realize that the difference between the good deaths and the hard deaths often pivoted on whether people had expressed their wishes and whether those wishes had in turn been respected by family and by the healthcare system as well. For the most part, Americans assume that such conversations take place between patients and care providers. But the truth is that those providers are often uncomfortable and very often totally untrained in having these conversations. When we began to form the Conversation Project, we went to the Institute for Healthcare Improvement in Cambridge, and they called together experts who had been laboring in this field for literally decades. And those experts told us that what we needed was to go outside the healthcare system and change the cultural norm from not talking about our wishes to talking about them. We needed to get people talking about this around the kitchen table. We believe that the starting point is, in fact, the kitchen table with the people we love who may be making decisions for us and with us and for us when the time comes. The truth is that we still engage in a kind of conspiracy of silence and denial. Parents are often reluctant to worry their adult children by raising this subject, and those adult children, in turn, are often reluctant to bring up the subject of dying with their parents. We attempt to protect each other, and in that process, we end up alone and often feeling lonely. There is often the same denial between doctors, nurses, healthcare providers, and patients, and often the same lack of communication. One of the very first things we did as we launched our project was to create a conversation starter kit, because we knew that people needed some guide, something to hold on to when they were beginning these conversations. We knew that our conversation guide had to be non-medical, non-scary. There isn't a checklist in the world long enough to cover everything that you can run into in the healthcare system. But what we can do is share our values, share what matters to us. One of the remarkable things for the Conversation Project is that since we launched, nearly 1 million people have used our Conversation Starter Kit that promises to make it easier for the people we love. This reminds us that people are ready, if still reluctant, and eager for our help. The Conversation Starter Kit, as I said, isn't scary or medical. It asks about your values, about how you want to live through the end of your life. It helps you think through what matters to you, not what's the matter with you. Some of the questions include, when you think about that last phase of your life, what's most important to you? Who do you want or not want to be involved in your care? Who would you like to make decisions on your behalf if you're not able to? Do you worry that you won't get enough care, or do you worry that you'll get overly aggressive care? Would you prefer to be actively involved in the decisions about your care, or would you rather have your doctors do what they think is best? So we ask people to share their worries. Our Conversation Starter Kit also offers tips on how to start the conversation, since starting is often the hardest part. We start by telling stories, by asking our parents or children for help. We start by making this a normal part of the transitions of life, whether it's the moment our children go off to college, or we go off to college, or get married, or the moment we have children, or the moment that we turn 65. One of the remarkable things to me as we've gone through this project is that the media people get it as well. We've had a lot of interviews and a lot of conversations with people in the media, and very often some of the most touching stories, like one done on NPR, are when the reporter goes back and has the conversation with her own parents. As NPR's Carrie Goldberg reported after she did this, "I thought this is something that I was doing for my dad, to get clear on his wishes. But in the process, I learned that he was doing it for me, that he wanted to make sure that I came away from his ending without guilt, knowing that though he didn't want to die, he didn't fear it." So where are we now in this social change? We have added more tools to our toolbox, a kit on how to talk to your doctor, because subtext, your doctor isn't going to talk to you. Another for the families of children with terminal disease. We have one for families of people with Alzheimer's and other dementias. And we did that in part, it was dear to my heart because my sister died of Alzheimer's, but because also so many people who read the starter kit said, yeah, but what if? What if they can't tell you what they want? What if they have cognitive problems? And we just completed a short guide to helping people. Again, it's called How to Choose a Healthcare Proxy. We knew that too many people had this piece of paper slid across the desk when they go to see their lawyer or their estate companion and say, "Oh, yeah, sign this over here. Tell me who to do this." And yet that decision, the decision as to who will make decisions for you if you can't make them for themselves, is one of the most critical that you can have. And we knew that you needed our help in doing this. Again, our message is, you are not alone. One of the surprising things that happened when we launched, too, is how many communities asked us to bring the Conversation Project to them as we are bringing it here to Cleveland. So we are helping now to bring this project to people where they work, where they live, and where they pray. We have relationships with about 400 different groups in 46 states. We have as well a faith-based initiative, and we have a Conversation Sabbath. This will be our third season that we had, and we like to say that the Conversation Sabbath involves clergy from Baptists to Buddhists, and certainly Presbyterians. And what that has done is to help clergy who also don't necessarily have the training in how to have these conversations, and to help people bring people to their spiritual home, where they will bring some of these issues that are so deep to their hearts. We're also in the midst of creating a curriculum for theological schools. We also piloted a public health campaign, like kind of an anti-smoking campaign, or a drunk driving, or anti-drunk driving campaign, I should say, that we hope will also get people to the kitchen table. In fact, we are so devoted to the image of the kitchen table that we have even promoted something called Death Over Dinner. By partnering with a West Coast group, we have had a series of dinner party conversations for people to talk out their feelings about this. And we even have a cookbook that was done by celebrity chefs who told us their stories as well as their recipes. Of course, in our attempt to change the cultural norm, we want people's wishes to be expressed and also respected. So we bring changes from the outside in, but also from the inside out. We see a kind of double helix of social change emerging. Change from outside the healthcare system brings change into the system, and they in turn bring it outside. The healthcare system, after all, has been kind of sluggish in changing. In a recent California study, 1 in 5 patients in a hospital's intensive care unit got treatment judged by the physician in charge to be ineffective, needlessly aggressive, or pointless, given the patient's dire state. This was not malicious. It was just a vast disconnect, a kind of terminal miscommunication. I do have to say that I think we are at a huge tipping point in this conversation. We began the conversation project, after all, only about 6 years ago, when you may remember that death panels were in the air. The very idea that a doctor would get paid for talking to patients rather than just doing procedures was described as death panels. And that has changed enormously. The indications of change include the popularity of Atul Gawande's wonderful book, Being Mortal. They include a powerful report from the Institute of Medicine, and finally, 2 years ago, Medicare did start paying doctors for having these conversations. It's a pretty huge example of social change. But there is also much, much left to be done. If this audacious idea were in that course catalog at Stanford, I would put it under humanities and not under economics. Our goal is to honor people's wishes, whatever they may be. And we don't say what people's wishes should be, just that they should be heard. But we know a few facts that I can share with you. We know that 1/4 of all Medicare expenses go to the 5% of people in the last year of life. We know that 1 in 10 elders has surgery in the last week of life. How much of that was futile or against the patient's wishes? We don't know. Today, the debate about healthcare is often framed in the language of cost-cutting and rationing, of things that will be taken away from you, less and less. But what if we can break out of that frame? This is one area in which letting patient and families' choices drive the decision could actually result in lower costs, financial, and much more importantly, emotional. We may even be able to rebuild trust in the medical system by respecting people's wishes, and more importantly, we can ensure a more humane death. I know a great deal about the debate around end of life has revolved around what's called death with dignity or doctor-assisted suicide, and whatever you think about that, and views are still extremely polarized, I want to remind you that that just plain isn't where the conversation is at. Last year, to give you an example, California became the 5th state in this country to permit physician-assisted suicide for mentally capable patients with less than 6 months to live. Whether you would support this or not, let's just remember, it's far too tempting to think that this is the solution to the people dying in ways they would not choose. Think about this. In California, in the first 6 months, there were 111 deaths by assisted suicide. That's 111 out of 183,000 deaths. The rate of death by assisted suicide was 6 out of 10,000. The huge majority of people don't want the right to die. They want the right to humane, loving care at the end. I'm going to pause for a moment or for 3 minutes, I should say, and show you a video of what it can look like when doctors and patients and families talk with each other. We call this video, for reasons you will see in a minute, The Soul Doctor and the Jazz Singer. Can we try it just a little louder? Can you hear? We're going to give it one more try. Or?
I'm not controlling the sound. So
put the closed captioning on.
I might be able to do that if you give me a second. I can try that.
It's. We'll give it 1 minute, 1 minute trial, and then we'll just send you to our website to see it.
Yeah, I don't think I got a closed caption version.
Okay. Well, in this wonderful video, which you can all see, what we have is a doctor talking with his patient, and the patient is has decided that she can't have any more treatment. The only treatment left for her was amputation, which she chose not to. And this doctor goes to her and says, okay, what is it that made you happy? And she, it turns out, was a jazz singer. And he said, really? Will you sing for me? She said, I don't sing anymore. And he says, please, sing for me. And she sings then with her daughter at her side. I will not attempt to sing to you, but she sings this wonderful song called What a Wonderful World. And what he says is what he says to all of his patients who are at the end of his life. What will make today a good day? And the resident says, that's such a simple question. We think these conversations would take so much time and energy and would be a failure. And what I've learned from this is how simple it is. I'm sorry you can't see that her singing, which was quite wonderful, but again, you can go to our website. I just want to say that I recognize what a big undertaking this project is to change the way we think about end of life. But we have made such big cultural changes before. Remember when we could only whisper the word cancer? Now we can all shout about erectile dysfunction. Remember how the model of birth in America has changed in little over a generation? It was not doctors who wanted women out of the stirrups. It wasn't doctors who invited husbands to come into the birthing room and bring a video camera and have the baby in a bathtub. It was women and families who basically said, birth isn't just a medical experience. It's a human experience. And now we are saying this about death. Dying is not just a medical experience. It is a human experience. So what can all of you do? You are our best hope in all of this. But what can you do as family and community members? Have the conversation with your families. Choose a healthcare decision maker. Give everyone in your workplace, in your neighborhood, in your congregation, a conversation starter kit, a proxy kit. Normalize it in so many ways. Now, we have some proxy kits and some kits from conversation starter kits, but I'm going to say that in every lecture you ever attended, people tell you to turn off your cell phones. I'm going to tell you, when you can, to turn on your cell phones and to text 345-345, and you will get up on your phone and then put in Talking Matters, and you will get up on your phone a copy of the Conversation Starter Kit that you can do, you can take home, you can share with your friends and family. Finally, I want to tell you one last story. At the end of one of our meetings not long ago, a woman, Karen Boudreau, sat at the table and scribbled a letter to her own children. And in part, this is what the letter said. Don't panic. It's okay. I'll try to let you know what I would want. And it ends, if you're faced with a snap decision, don't panic. Choose comfort, choose home, choose less intervention, choose to be together at my side, holding my hand, singing, laughing, loving, celebrating, and carrying on. I will keep loving you and watching and being proud of you. So we begin with the same question everywhere. Have you had the conversation? And we hope that beginning right here in Cleveland, we can ensure that the resounding answer will be yes. Thank you.
We do have a microphone, and Ellen has agreed to take some questions. It will help if you come forward to ask your question from the microphone. That reduces the feedback that we'll hear. So if you have a question to ask, please come on forward.
And if you'd rather stand up, I will repeat it. So go ahead. Yeah.
I'm fortunate enough to have 4 children and a spouse, and I believe that my family is sort of, here's Keeler's language, above average in most respects, but I can imagine that. I'm just saying I have 4 kids and a spouse, and I'm imagining the day coming when that conversation needs to be held. And I am concerned about unanimity with a group. And my question is, do you recommend that a single individual be charged with the responsibility to make the final decisions, or would you recommend that a broader group be involved?
So the question is what to do about his 4 contentious, perhaps, children? They're normal, and wife. Family of potentially 5 people, all of whom are going to care a lot. And I've had this I once had this conversation. My best friend has 4 daughters. And when I got involved in the Conversation Project, the eldest one said, oh my God, we better talk to each other because I can see us having a fight over my mother's comatose body. So this was not a charming description, but she had a point. We know that there often can be disagreements with members of a family saying, I know what mom would want, or dad, and the other one said, no, I know. And that is why you have to tell them and not leave them guessing what you would want. Because it isn't, if you're the healthcare decision maker, it isn't about what you want, it isn't about who loved mom more. It's about what mom or dad or whoever wanted. So you have to bring that person into the center of this conversation. And we do, I think, in most places recommend that one person has the final decision to be made, but that person is expected to, that conversation has to go across the whole family before that, so that everyone is, hopefully, on the same page. And remember, again, when families are not on the same page, it's generally because they haven't been told what the person wants, and that in fact it is that person's decision and not the rest of the families.
Good afternoon. Your talk was wonderful, and the reason I wanted to make just one tiny statement, I'm a retired ombudsman. I worked for the Cleveland Clinic very happily for many years, and I would say the focus of this is the kitchen table and the conversation at home. The last place anybody should be making decisions about end of life is while they're in the hospital. And it happens an awful lot.
Yes, it does.
It's really important to emphasize that. And when a person is admitted to the hospital, one of the questions that they're asked, they're by law, they must be asked if they have advance directives. And a lot of times what happens is that's when the ombudsman gets involved, and people they don't know who are not close to them. So I would say the most important takeaway here is to do it at home with your loved ones and not in the hospital. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I should, you gave me a wonderful opportunity to share another statistic, which is that half of all the people over 65 who are admitted to a hospital cannot make decisions for themselves. So if they don't have a decision maker, who's it going to default to? The ICU doctor? They're going to start searching for the rest of your family members in the middle of a crisis. So it is extraordinarily important to do this early, which is why we recommend having the conversation early. It's also why we recommend picking a proxy. If everybody well, what the heck, let's go wide. If everybody in Cleveland had a proxy, and hopefully had that conversation with the proxy, because it isn't enough to just sort of scratch your head and say, my cousin, she's an RN, I'll pick her, if you haven't talked to that person. But it is critical also to pick someone to make decisions for you if you can't make them for yourself. Yes.
Thank you so much for bringing this topic to Cleveland. I'm an ICU physician and intensive care doctor. An intensive care doctor? Now? So this is the main problem, because sometimes they are discussing all these things in the medical crisis. And we need to navigate and think about, and many of the family members, what they think is what they want, but we need to move them to think what the patient would have wanted. So when, I don't know who talked first, when I have to have that conversation, so I just say now, because we need to talk when we are all healthy, because something can happen today, right? So that's the main issue. And in my family, one of my daughters said, "Mom, stop talking about death." So perhaps I'm too to the other side because I see death too much. But the thing is, we need to talk about, and I love the conversation project because first is you yourself think about it. And there's a guide like what topic we need to think about. And then talk to your loved ones. And I think in that talking, you're going to understand who is going to make the decision that you want.
Yeah.
Without their values there.
Well, thank you. We have somebody on the front lines as an ICU doctor who has the experience of having so many people come in who have not had that conversation. And one thing I think would be hugely useful is if every doctor at your annual visit or any other visit, you couldn't get into a hospital or a practice without them saying, who's your proxy? Who's your decision maker? There are some hospitals, for example, some cancer hospitals, where you can't have your third visit without identifying who that decision maker will be. But it is interesting and tricky sometimes for the doctor to say to the family, wait, what would Dad want? This isn't about you know, I'll tell you a funny story you will appreciate. And I was giving a talk in Virginia, and after the talk, a doctor came up to me and he said, you know what my biggest problem is? And I said, no, what is your biggest problem? My biggest problem is what I call the seagull syndrome. It's the child who's been least involved, who flies in from the coast and dumps all over the plan, only he didn't say dumps. And so I think it is something that doctors experience and that we all have to be aware can happen.
Hi there. My name is Lisa Vigil-Schattinger. I have had the great good fortune to have some of these conversations with loved ones, and it's always a profound and sometimes surprising experience, finding what people's wishes are that you don't expect. And I think it's so important to understand people's wishes. I've also had the great benefit of being with a loved one when they died, surrounded by whom they wanted to be surrounded and in the time and place that they chose, because they did choose medical aid in dying or physician-assisted death. And since 18% of Americans now have the right to choose that option, I really would like to see that respected as part of the conversation, and that it can be very empowering to those people who do choose it, and a very full conversation with medical professionals and family and their spiritual caregivers to fully understand those wishes and respect them.
Thank you. And I am on record as having supported that law, because under the pretty rare circumstances that it covers, I would want that option too. I think it's, however, really important to recognize that this is for a very small portion. And the fear that people will think, well, okay, took care of that, we don't have to worry about providing you, you know, humane hospice care, et cetera, because if you're uncomfortable, you can just, you know, call your neighborhood doctor and that's the end of it. It's a fear that people will think that's the solution, and it just isn't. And Oregon, just as another figure, only 1 out of every 500 deaths is by doctor-assisted suicide. Yeah, I'm just saying, I don't think you're really disagreeing with me, that we have to recognize that the most important thing that we have to do is think about the 499 and how do we have those conversations. And as I said, I'm on record as a columnist of having supported that, but I'm very aware of its limitations. So.
I heard recently that several of our top local hospitals do not respect the wishes of people at the end of their life because they're partially or fully funded by the Catholic Church. And I wanted to know if anyone else knows about this or if this is true.
I don't know the answer to that question in Cleveland. Somebody else might, but no doctor under any of these laws is required to perform a doctor-assisted suicide. So, but I don't know the answer to that.
Yes, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about these 5 states that give doctors permission to help people die, because I'm feeling if I got into a situation at the end of my life where I was having difficulty breathing, like, God forbid, Lou Gehrig's disease, I would not want to live, and yet my doctor couldn't help me die. So does that mean if I would get a diagnosis where I'm going to have difficulty breathing, that I'd have to move to one of those 5 states, and do you have to establish residency? I find it all very confusing.
Yeah, and I think that's why it has become such a hot issue, because people do find it very confusing. And I think that we'll see how that shakes down in the next many years. I also think that it's still pretty rare that people have to suffer with palliative care being as advancing as much as it has. But again, I think that whatever it is that you wish, including assisted suicide, whatever it is that you wish, should really be discussed with your family, because that can be pretty traumatic too if it happens without your family knowing what your wishes were. I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, I enjoyed your talk, and my question or comment is, what do you do about blended families? You know, because blended, because I could see where a whole lot of contention and things coming forth from different parts of the family in that case. Thank you. Yes,
as someone who's lived in a blended family, absolutely. And also there are different ethnic experiences. You know, we're very aware that the African American community, for reasons that we all know historically, have been much more worried about not getting enough health care than about getting too much health care or unwanted health care. And so they have a lower incidence of signing proxies and advance directives. And that we have brought into the churches have been very helpful to us in bringing the message that we are talking to those families. Now, if you're talking about blended, your average blended family period, with the contentiousness being not that different than the 4 children and 1 wife, the answer again is that the individual has to have that conversation early with various members of the family, as extended as possible. And if you don't want to have that conversation verbally, fill out your conversation starter kit and send it to everybody in the family and say, this is my decision. It's up to me, and I want you all to respect what my wishes are, and then also to pick the person who is most likely to be respectful of them, to be your healthcare proxy. I think we are. Thank you very much for your...
We are so grateful to Ellen for sharing her work and wisdom with us today. And I thank you all for being here and for the courage that it takes just to be here and engage this and to hopefully start or continue having these conversations with your loved ones. And I speak for all of the partners in this event that our hope is that in many ways, for those of you who aren't already having this conversation, this event can really kick off an opportunity for that to begin for many of us as we learn together to value these conversations, no matter what stage we're in of our lives, and to approach them with anticipation and hope rather than fear or dread. Bill Finn, the CEO of the Hospice of the Western Reserve, has been saying for a while now how great it would be if, in the same way we've learned to check those batteries on our smoke detectors when the time changes, if we could see Thanksgiving, that time that comes around every year when we're often sitting at a table with our loved ones, as the time to check in about our end-of-life wishes. Because the other thing is, you can have these conversations, and if, time goes by, your wishes are likely to change. So it's one of those conversations that you don't want to just have once, but check in over and over again. So if you are looking for a conversation around your Thanksgiving table that isn't politics, and I know I am, then we suggest having a conversation about death. So we'd like to send you home with something that might help you in this effort. As you leave, you'll see some volunteers at the doors holding baskets, and we invite you to take a card from a basket. Those are called Go Wish cards, and they're a way of playing a little game, another hopefully holiday tradition for some of us. And Go Wish is a game you can play alone or with a partner or with a group. There's lots of ways to do it. But on each card, you will find the website where you can order a full deck. So we'll give you one card here today and you can get a sense of what it is, but then if you go to that website, you can order a full deck and you've got plenty of time to get it in the mail before Thanksgiving. So I hope you'll do that. We also wanted to provide those of you who are really inspired to continue this conversation today with some resources to do that. In the main front entrance, there is a table with resources from Cleveland Clinic, from Hospice of the Western Reserve, and there are conversation starter kits that Ellen spoke about. So take one, take a few, take them to hand out to your family and friends. And also, if you want to get into the actual state forms that were mentioned, there will be some folks from the Hospice of the Western Reserve right over here in this chapel area who have the bigger kits from the Hospice of the Western Reserve. Those are called Courage in Conversation, and they actually have the forms with them. People here will help you fill them out. So if you want to do that, come on over here. Otherwise, as you leave, please take a Go Wish card. And you can find all of these resources also online in a downloadable form. And of course, you can text and get it right to your smartphone. I will just say that on the back of your program and also on the tables back there, we have more information about who we are as a faith community here at the Church of the Covenant. We've got lots of programs that are open to the public, and we'd love to have you join us anytime. Thank you so much again for coming today. Thank you to our partners, to Ellen Goodman for being here. Have a wonderful afternoon.